The fluorescent lights in the office supply room always flickered in the same pattern. 3 quick blinks, then steady for about 10 seconds, then 3 more blinks. I'd memorized this rhythm during countless late nights at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm tucked between a subway and a nail salon in downtown Cedar Falls. That's where I first told Marcus about the idea that would change everything. Standing between boxes of printer paper and toner cartridges at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, the trust I placed in him that night would become the foundation of my biggest professional mistake, though I wouldn't understand that for another 8 months. Marcus had been my cubicle neighbor for 5 years, the kind of colleague who remembers your coffee order and asks about your weekend plans with genuine interest. We'd developed that comfortable workplace friendship that grows slowly, built on shared frustrations about management decisions and quiet celebrations of small victories. When I think about trust now, I realize it's not something you decide to give. It accumulates like dust, settling so gradually you don't notice it until you're breathing it in with every interaction. Our friendship had roots in those small moments that make office life bearable. Marcus would cover for me when I needed to leave early for my mom's doctor appointments, and I'd stay late to help him finish reports when his perfectionism got the better of him. We shared the same corner of the building, where the heating system never worked properly, and the coffee maker made that grinding sound that meant it was about to break down again. During lunch breaks, we'd walk to Murphy's Diner 3 blocks away, where the waitress knew our orders by heart and the apple pie was always fresh on Wednesdays. These weren't grand gestures of loyalty, just the daily give and take that builds confidence in another person's character. I learned that Marcus preferred decaf after 2 p.m., that he worried about his younger sister's college tuition, and that he had a habit of clicking his pen when he was thinking through complex problems. The accumulation of these details created a sense of knowing someone deeply, though I would later discover how much about him remained hidden beneath the surface of pleasant conversation and shared complaints about our boss. The idea came to me during one of those sleepless nights that every professional knows too well. I'd been tossing and turning after a particularly brutal meeting with our department head, Mr. Garrison, who had a talent for making you feel incompetent, even when you'd done everything right. He'd criticized our client retention system in front of the entire team, calling it outdated and inefficient, words that stung because I'd been working within that broken system for years, trying to make it function despite its obvious flaws. As I lay there at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, the solution crystallized in my mind like pieces of a puzzle suddenly falling into place. What if we could create a client tracking system that actually anticipated their needs, instead of just recording their complaints? What if we could build something that would transform how our firm approached customer relationships? I grabbed the notebook I kept on my nightstand and started scribbling, my handwriting barely legible in the darkness, but my thoughts flowing with unusual clarity. The more I wrote, the more excited I became about the potential impact this could have, not just for our department, but for the entire company's future. The next morning, I arrived at work 30 minutes early, clutching my notebook like a precious artifact. The office was still mostly empty, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of the janitor's vacuum cleaner from the floor above. Marcus arrived at his usual time, 8:15 a.m. sharp, carrying his thermos of coffee and wearing that slightly rumpled shirt that meant he'd probably stayed up too late watching Netflix again. When he saw me practically vibrating with excitement, he raised an eyebrow and asked what had gotten into me. I pulled him into the supply room, away from the few early arrivals who might overhear, and opened my notebook to the pages I'd filled the night before. "I think I figured out how to fix everything," I whispered, as if sharing state secrets. His eyes lit up as I explained the concept, how we could use predictive analytics to identify client needs before they became problems, how we could automate follow-ups while maintaining personal touch, how we could revolutionize the way our firm operated. Marcus listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood not just the technical aspects but the broader implications for our careers and the company's success. When I finished explaining, Marcus looked at me with something I interpreted as admiration. and said the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "We should do this together. This is brilliant, and I think we could really make it work as a team." The word "we" felt natural, even comforting, because everything good that had happened in our department had involved some form of collaboration. I'd never been the type to seek spotlight or claim sole credit for achievements, and the idea of sharing this project with someone I trusted felt both practical and emotionally satisfying. Marcus had connections in the IT department that could help with the technical implementation, and his presentation skills were stronger than mine, making him the obvious choice for pitching to upper management. We shook hands right there in the supply room, surrounded by the mundane supplies of office life, sealing what I believed was a partnership that would elevate both our careers. Looking back, I realized that handshake represented more than just professional collaboration. It was me placing my future in the hands of someone I'd misjudged completely. The email Marcus sent the following week made me feel like I was finally being seen for my potential rather than just my reliability. He'd copied me on a message to our department manager, Sarah Chen, suggesting we schedule a meeting to discuss what he called an innovative client management proposal that could significantly improve our retention rates and operational efficiency. The formal language was so different from his usual casual communication style that I felt proud to be included as a co-creator of something that sounded so professional and promising. When Sarah responded within hours, expressing enthusiasm and suggesting we present to the senior management team within the month, I felt a surge of validation that had been missing from my work life for years. This was my chance to prove that I was more than just someone who could be counted on to handle routine tasks and cover for absent colleagues. The recognition felt overdue but deeply satisfying, like finally being invited to sit at the adults' table after years of watching from the sidelines. That same week, Marcus introduced a new element to our collaboration when he mentioned that Sarah would be joining our planning sessions. "She's got experience with visual presentations," he explained, "and she can help us make sure everything looks professional when we present to the executive team." Sarah was relatively new to our department, having transferred from the marketing division just 3 months earlier, but she'd already made an impression with her polished appearance and confident demeanor. She wore the kind of clothes that looked expensive without being flashy, and she had a way of speaking that made even mundane topics sound important and strategic. I welcomed her involvement because I knew my strengths lay in conceptual thinking rather than visual design. And if Sarah could help make our presentation more compelling, that would benefit all of us. The 3 of us began meeting twice a week in Conference Room B, a windowless space that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, where we'd spread out printed documents and brainstorm ways to refine and present the client management system. These meetings felt productive and collaborative, with each of us contributing our unique skills toward a common goal that would hopefully transform our professional lives. The changes didn't announce themselves with dramatic confrontations or heated arguments. Instead, they crept in like shadows at dusk, so gradually that by the time I noticed them, they'd already reshaped the landscape of my professional relationships. It started with small things that seemed insignificant at the time. A meeting moved 30 minutes earlier without anyone thinking to call me. A shared document that somehow got saved without my latest edits. Conversations that paused just a beat too long when I approached. These weren't the kinds of betrayals you read about in corporate thrillers, with backstabbing villains and obvious power grabs. This was something more insidious, a slow erosion of inclusion disguised as natural evolution of our project dynamics. I began to feel like I was watching my own story unfold from the outside, as if someone had gradually turned down the volume on my voice until I could barely hear myself speak. The frustration wasn't just about being excluded from decisions. It was about the growing realization that exclusion was becoming my new normal, and everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable with this arrangement. The first real sign that something fundamental had shifted came during what I thought was a routine Tuesday morning. I arrived at my desk to find a calendar notification for a meeting I hadn't been invited to, visible only because Marcus had accidentally left his screen unlocked when he went to get coffee. The meeting was titled Client System Review, Phase 2, and scheduled for 10 a.m. in the small conference room we'd been using for our collaborative sessions. My stomach dropped as I realized this was clearly about our project, the system I'd conceived, and we'd been developing together, but somehow I wasn't part of this particular discussion. When Marcus returned with his coffee, I casually mentioned seeing the meeting on his calendar, trying to keep my voice light and assuming it was simply an oversight. He looked uncomfortable for just a moment before explaining that he and Sarah had needed to discuss some technical details with the IT department, and they thought it would be more efficient to handle the preliminary conversations before bringing me in. The word preliminary stung because nothing about our project had been preliminary when I'd first shared the idea with him in that supply room. I wanted to argue, to point out that I should be involved in all aspects of the project I'd created, but something in his tone discouraged pushback, as if my concerns were unreasonable and slightly embarrassing. Over the following weeks, I noticed a pattern emerging that made my chest tighten with a recognition I wasn't ready to face. Marcus and Sarah had begun having what they called informal check-ins at Murphy's Diner, the same place where Marcus and I had shared countless lunch conversations about work and life. I discovered this when I overheard Sarah mentioning to another colleague that she'd grabbed coffee with Marcus to go over some presentation ideas, and that they'd made good progress on the client system framework. The casual way she said it, as if these meetings were perfectly normal and expected, made me realize that I'd been systematically excluded from conversations about my own creation. When I asked Marcus about these meetings, he assured me they were just brainstorming sessions and that nothing concrete was being decided without my input. But the damage was already done. I could feel the project slipping away from me like water through cupped hands, and my attempts to hold on to it only seemed to make me appear desperate and possessive. The worst part was that both Marcus and Sarah maintained their friendly demeanor toward me, as if the slow erasure of my involvement was just a natural evolution of our collaborative process, rather than a deliberate strategy to marginalize my contributions. The document that disappeared from my computer was the moment I realized this wasn't just about different working styles or communication preferences. This was about power, ownership, and the uncomfortable truth that I'd been naive about the nature of workplace relationships. The file contained all my original notes, research, and development timeline for the client management system, painstakingly compiled over weeks of late-night work and weekend research. It was my proof of concept, my blueprint, my intellectual fingerprint on the project that was supposed to change my career trajectory. One morning, I opened my laptop to find the file simply gone, as if it had never existed. When I asked Marcus about it, he said he thought I'd moved it to our shared folder. But when I checked there, I found only sanitized versions of documents that had been edited and reformatted beyond recognition. His explanation that he'd accidentally saved over it while organizing our files felt hollow, especially when delivered with the kind of apologetic shrug that suggested mistakes happen and there was nothing more to discuss. I spent my lunch break that day sitting in my car in the parking lot behind the office building, staring at the dumpster where the cleaning crew disposed of shredded documents, feeling like my professional identity had been discarded just as casually. The jokes began to feel different after that, tinged with an edge that transformed friendly workplace banter into something that made me question my place in the group dynamic. During our weekly team meeting, Sarah made a comment about how great ideas always come from team collaboration, and how individual contributions are just the starting point for real innovation. Marcus laughed and added, "Yeah, nothing gets created in a vacuum anymore. It's all about building on each other's work." I was sitting right there, listening to them discuss the fundamental philosophy of creation and ownership as if I weren't the person who'd conceived the entire project during a sleepless night in my studio apartment. The other team members nodded along, and I found myself nodding too, even though every word felt like a small betrayal of my own experience. Later that afternoon, I walked to the pharmacy down the street to pick up a prescription, and the elderly pharmacist asked how work was going. I found myself unable to answer, not because work was going badly, but because I no longer knew what role I played in my own professional story. The sense of displacement was so complete that I couldn't even articulate what was happening to me. I just knew that something essential had been taken without my permission, and I was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of involvement remained. The exclusion from decision-making conversations became so routine that I began to doubt my own memory of how the project had originated. Sarah would send updates directly to Marcus, who would then forward them to me with brief notes like, FYI, or let me know if you have thoughts. The messages were always professionally courteous, but they positioned me as a peripheral observer rather than a core contributor to the work. When I tried to insert myself back into the process by sending detailed feedback or additional research, my contributions were acknowledged with polite thank you messages, but rarely incorporated into the actual work. It was like being slowly edited out of a story I'd written, watching my character become less central with each revision, until I was barely mentioned in the final draft. The frustration was compounded by the fact that Marcus and Sarah continued to treat me cordially in all other contexts. They'd still ask about my weekend plans, still include me in general team discussions, still maintain the surface-level friendliness that made it difficult to articulate exactly what was wrong. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, questioning whether I was being overly sensitive or if there was real reason for concern. The gaslighting wasn't intentional or malicious. It was just the natural result of two people who'd decided they could execute my vision more effectively without my involvement, and who'd convinced themselves that this was better for everyone involved, including me. The shift became undeniable when I realized that my own project had developed a momentum and direction that no longer required my input or approval. Marcus and Sarah had begun referring to it as our client management initiative in emails and meetings, speaking about it with the confidence of people who'd been working together on something for months. They'd created timelines, assigned responsibilities, and made strategic decisions about implementation without consulting me, treating my original concept as raw material that had been refined through their superior collaboration and expertise. When I tried to raise concerns about the direction they were taking, suggesting modifications or alternative approaches based on my original vision, they'd listen politely and then explain why their approach was more practical or strategic. The conversations left me feeling like a junior employee being educated about business realities rather than the originator of the idea being consulted about its development. I started avoiding the break room because I couldn't bear to overhear more casual conversations about the project that had once been my proudest professional achievement. The sense of loss was complicated by the fact that the project itself was moving forward successfully. It was just moving forward without me, as if I'd been a catalyst for something that no longer needed my presence to continue growing. The morning of the presentation, I chose my clothes with the careful attention of someone preparing for a job interview or a first date. I'd bought a new blazer specifically for this occasion, a deep navy blue that made me feel professional and confident, and I'd even gotten my hair styled at the salon in the strip mall near my apartment. This was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of months of work and the launching pad for a new phase of my career. I arrived at the office 45 minutes early, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that felt like the first day of school multiplied by 10. The presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main conference room, the one with the polished table and the view of the parking lot where important decisions were made and careers were either advanced or stalled. I'd rehearsed my parts of the presentation in my bathroom mirror for weeks, timing each section and refining my delivery until I felt ready to represent our work with the professionalism it deserved. As I sat at my desk that morning, trying to focus on routine tasks while my mind raced with anticipation, I had no idea that I was about to witness the most devastating betrayal of my professional life unfold in real time. The first indication that something was wrong came when Marcus and Sarah arrived together, carrying matching folders and wearing expressions of focused determination that seemed to exclude me from their shared purpose. They'd clearly met earlier that morning to coordinate their approach, and watching them move through the office with synchronized efficiency made me realize that whatever was about to happen had been planned without my knowledge or input. When I approached them to discuss our final preparations, they assured me that everything was handled and that I should just relax and let them take care of the details. The word details felt ominous, as if my role in this presentation had been reduced to something peripheral and minor. I wanted to insist on reviewing our materials one more time, to ensure we were all aligned on key points and transitions, but their confidence seemed to suggest that such preparation was unnecessary, or even counterproductive. As we walked toward the conference room together, I felt like a third wheel in my own professional triumph, following behind two people who seemed to share an understanding about the upcoming presentation that somehow didn't include me. The conference room was already filled with senior management when we arrived, their faces wearing the politely expectant expressions that executives reserve for presentations that might actually matter to the company's future. Mr. Garrison was there, along with the regional director I'd only met once before, and several department heads whose approval could make or break careers. I took a seat in the back row, as Marcus had suggested, telling myself that being in the audience would give me a better perspective on how our presentation was being received. But as I watched Marcus and Sarah set up their laptops and arrange their materials at the front of the room, I began to feel like a spectator at my own execution. The presentation slides were loading on the screen, and I could see from my position that they'd been redesigned with a professional template I'd never seen before, featuring graphics and layouts that bore no resemblance to the materials we'd been working on together. When Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak, his opening words hit me like a physical blow. This client management system emerged from extensive collaboration between myself and Sarah, building on insights we've developed through months of working together on client retention challenges. The word collaboration felt like a knife twisting in my chest, not because collaboration was inherently wrong, but because it erased the specific moment when I'd conceived this entire system during that sleepless night in March. As Marcus continued his introduction, explaining the genesis of the project as if it had grown organically from their partnership, I felt my professional identity being rewritten in real time. He spoke about our analysis of current client retention weaknesses and our innovative approach to predictive customer management, using language that made it sound like the idea had emerged from their joint expertise, rather than from my desperate late night attempt to solve a problem that had been keeping me awake. Sarah nodded along, occasionally interjecting with comments like, "Exactly, and that's right," reinforcing the impression that this was their shared brainchild rather than my concept that they'd helped develop. The executives were taking notes, nodding approvingly, and asking the kinds of engaged questions that suggested they were impressed by what they were hearing. I should have felt proud that my idea was being so well received, but instead I felt like I was watching someone else get credit for my thoughts. My sleepless nights, my moment of inspiration that had started this entire process. The moment that shattered my remaining composure came when Sarah clicked to a slide that was almost word for word identical to a page from my original notebook, the one that had disappeared from my computer weeks earlier. The slide outlined the core philosophy of proactive client management, using the exact phrase I'd scribbled at 3 a.m., anticipating needs before they become problems. Hearing Sarah speak those words as if they were her own creation felt like watching someone wear your clothes and claim they'd always owned them. She delivered the content with polished confidence, explaining the theoretical framework and practical applications with the kind of smooth presentation skills that made the ideas sound both innovative and achievable. The executives were clearly impressed, leaning forward and asking follow-up questions that Sarah answered with the assurance of someone who'd spent considerable time developing these concepts. I wanted to stand up and scream that those were my words, my ideas, my 3 a.m. breakthrough that had started this entire project, but I sat frozen in my chair, paralyzed by the surreal experience of watching my intellectual property being presented as someone else's innovation. The betrayal was so complete and so public that I couldn't even process it fully. I just sat there, watching my professional future being redistributed to people who'd never spent a sleepless night, worrying about client retention or staring at the ceiling searching for solutions. The questions from the executives became increasingly enthusiastic as the presentation continued, with several people commenting on the fresh thinking and strategic innovation that Marcus and Sarah were bringing to the department. One of the directors asked about implementation timelines, and Marcus responded with detailed plans that he and Sarah had apparently developed without my involvement, speaking about resources and deadlines as if they were the project managers who'd been overseeing this work from the beginning. Another executive wanted to know about the competitive advantages this system would provide, and Sarah answered with market analysis and benchmarking data that I'd never seen before, suggesting they'd been doing additional research and development beyond our original scope. The level of preparation and coordination they'd achieved without my knowledge was both impressive and devastating. It was clear that they'd been working together far more extensively than I'd realized, treating our original collaboration as just the starting point for a project that had evolved far beyond my involvement. As I listened to them field questions with expertise and confidence, I began to understand that this wasn't just about stealing credit for my idea. It was about completely replacing me as the intellectual architect of the solution I'd conceived. The final blow came during the closing remarks, when Mr. Garrison stood up and congratulated Marcus and Sarah on their exceptional collaborative work and their innovative approach to solving long-standing client retention challenges. He spoke about the importance of employees who could think strategically and work together effectively, praising their partnership as an example of the kind of teamwork that would drive the company's future success. As the room erupted in applause, I felt my professional identity dissolving completely, replaced by the humiliating realization that I'd been written out of my own story, so thoroughly that no one even noticed my absence from the congratulations. Marcus and Sarah were shaking hands with executives, accepting praise and fielding questions about next steps, while I sat in the back row feeling like a ghost haunting my own career advancement. The applause seemed to go on forever, each clap echoing in my ears like a confirmation that my contributions had been successfully erased and redistributed to people who'd never experienced the original spark of inspiration that had started this entire process. I left the conference room before the presentation officially ended, mumbling something about a phone call that needed my immediate attention. The hallway outside felt like a decompression chamber, where I could finally breathe without having to maintain the pretense of being happy about what I'd just witnessed. I walked to the bathroom on the lower level, the one that nobody used because it was tucked away near the storage rooms, and locked myself in the handicapped stall, where I could finally allow myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The tears came in waves, not just from sadness, but from a rage so complete that I couldn't even articulate it to myself. I'd been professionally murdered in front of an audience, and the weapon had been my own creation, turned against me with surgical precision by people I'd trusted with my most valuable professional asset. As I sat there on the cold tile floor, still wearing my new blazer and carefully styled hair, I realized that this wasn't just about losing credit for a project. It was about learning that in the corporate world, trust is a luxury that can be weaponized against you, and loyalty is often just a temporary convenience that evaporates when more valuable opportunities arise. The days after the presentation felt like walking through a world where everyone had agreed to pretend that a fundamental injustice had never occurred. Marcus returned to his normal routine of arriving at 8:15 a.m. and making small talk about weekend plans, as if he hadn't just stolen the most important idea of my career in front of the entire executive team. Sarah continued her practice of saying good morning with a bright smile and asking about my lunch plans, maintaining the same friendly demeanor that had made me trust her involvement in the first place. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could people who had just committed such a profound betrayal continue to act as if nothing significant had happened? I found myself studying their faces for signs of guilt or acknowledgement, searching for some indication that they understood the magnitude of what they'd done. But I saw only the bland pleasantness of colleagues who believed they'd handled a successful project presentation. The silence around the betrayal was more devastating than the betrayal itself, because it meant that not only had my contribution been erased, but the erasure itself was being treated as if it were perfectly normal and unremarkable. The feedback meeting that I wasn't invited to felt like the final confirmation that I'd been completely excised from my own professional achievement. I learned about it the same way I'd learned about so many other developments, by accident, through an email that Marcus had forgotten to remove me from when he forwarded scheduling information to someone else. The meeting was titled Client Management System, Implementation Planning, and it included all the key stakeholders who would be responsible for turning the concept into reality. When I realized that decisions about my idea were being made without my input, I felt a desperation that bordered on panic, as if I were watching my house burn down while being told I wasn't allowed to call the fire department. I tried to approach Sarah about including me in future planning sessions, framing my request as a desire to contribute to the project's success, rather than a demand for recognition. Her response was a masterclass in professional dismissal. She thanked me for my interest, acknowledged that I'd been part of the early brainstorming, and then explained that the implementation phase required a more focused team structure that wouldn't include everyone who'd contributed to the initial concept development. My attempt to confront Marcus about the situation was perhaps the most painful conversation of my entire career. Not because of what was said, but because of how expertly he deflected any responsibility for what had happened. I asked him to meet me for coffee at Murphy's Diner, the same place where we'd shared countless friendly conversations, hoping that the familiar setting might encourage honesty about how our collaboration had evolved into something that excluded me entirely. He listened patiently as I explained how hurt and confused I felt about being marginalized from a project I'd originated, nodding sympathetically and making occasional sounds of understanding that suggested he cared about my feelings. When I finished speaking, he sighed deeply and said that he could understand why I might feel left out, but that project dynamics naturally evolve, and that everyone had contributed ideas that had shaped the final proposal. The word everyone was particularly galling because it suggested that my foundational contribution was equivalent to random suggestions offered during meetings, rather than the core innovation that had started the entire process. He assured me that there was no intention to exclude anyone, and that these kinds of misunderstandings were common in collaborative work environments where lots of people contribute to successful outcomes. Sarah's response to my concerns was even more sophisticated in its dismissiveness, delivered with the kind of corporate speak that made my legitimate grievances sound like emotional overreactions. When I managed to corner her in the break room and asked directly about my role in the project going forward, she gave me a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but felt condescending, and explained that collaborative projects often involve multiple contributors, whose individual inputs get synthesized into comprehensive solutions. She used air quotes around several of these phrases, as if she were explaining basic workplace dynamics to someone who didn't understand how professional environments operated. The subtext was clear. I was being naive and possessive about intellectual property in a setting where ideas belonged to the team and the company rather than to individuals. When I pressed her about the specific elements of the presentation that had come directly from my original notes, she responded that great minds think alike, and that it was impossible to trace the origin of ideas in truly collaborative environments. The gaslighting was so complete and so professionally executed that I left the conversation questioning my own memory of how the project had developed, wondering if perhaps I was being unreasonable in my expectations about recognition and inclusion. The institutional response to my concerns was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire experience, because it confirmed that what had happened to me was not just tolerated but actually expected within the company's culture. When I finally worked up the courage to schedule a meeting with our department head, Mr. Garrison, I spent hours preparing my case, organizing documentation that would prove my foundational role in developing the client management system. I brought printouts of early emails, copies of research I'd compiled, and even photographs of my original handwritten notes that I'd taken before the notebook disappeared from my desk. Garrison listened politely for about 10 minutes before interrupting to explain that successful projects in modern workplaces were always collaborative efforts, and that trying to assign individual credit was counterproductive to team dynamics. He praised the final presentation as evidence that our department was capable of innovative thinking and effective teamwork, completely ignoring my documentation of how the project had actually originated. When I persisted in explaining that my contributions had been systematically erased, he became visibly impatient and suggested that I needed to adjust my perspective and focus on being a team player, rather than worrying about individual recognition. The meeting ended with him recommending that I consider professional development opportunities that might help me better understand collaborative work environments. The gradual social isolation that followed was almost as painful as the professional betrayal, because it meant losing not just credit for my work, but also the workplace relationships that had made my job bearable. Colleagues who had previously included me in lunch plans and casual conversations began to treat me with the polite distance reserved for people who were known to be difficult or negative. Word had apparently spread that I was unhappy about the client management project, and in the twisted logic of office politics, this made me someone to avoid rather than someone who deserved support. The same people who had complimented my work ethic and problem-solving skills for years now seemed to view me as a troublemaker who couldn't accept the natural evolution of collaborative projects. I began eating lunch alone in my car, parked behind the building near the dumpsters, because the break room conversations had become a minefield of casual references to the successful presentation and great teamwork that felt like deliberate provocations. The loneliness was compounded by the realization that my professional reputation had been permanently damaged, not by poor performance or ethical violations, but by the simple act of expecting recognition for my own ideas. The final insult came in the form of a company-wide email celebrating the innovative client management initiative that had been developed through exceptional collaboration between Marcus Johnson and Sarah Chen. The email included quotes from satisfied clients who had already benefited from early implementation of the system, along with projections showing how the new approach would improve retention rates and increase revenue over the next fiscal year. Reading about the success of my own idea while being completely erased from its history felt like attending my own funeral and hearing the eulogy credit my life's achievements to other people. The email was forwarded and shared throughout the company, generating congratulatory responses that praised Marcus and Sarah for their vision and leadership in solving long-standing client retention challenges. I printed a copy of that email and kept it in my desk drawer, not as evidence for some future appeal or complaint, but as a reminder of how completely and professionally a person's contributions could be erased from corporate memory. The document served as proof that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. It had actually happened. It had been formalized, and it had been celebrated by an organization that either didn't know or didn't care about the real origin of the innovation they were now profiting from. The announcement came on a Thursday morning in an email marked high importance, the kind of corporate communication that pretends to be exciting news while actually delivering professional death sentences, wrapped in congratulatory language. Marcus had been promoted to Senior Client Relations Manager, a newly created position that would allow him to lead the implementation of innovative client management strategies across all regional offices. Sarah had been elevated to Director of Strategic Initiatives, making her responsible for identifying and developing forward-thinking solutions to enhance customer retention and satisfaction. The email described their promotions as recognition for their exceptional collaborative work and demonstrated ability to transform conceptual innovations into practical business solutions. As I read these announcements at my desk, surrounded by the same beige cubicle walls I'd been staring at for 5 years, I felt the final pieces of my professional identity crumbling like old plaster. The people who had stolen my idea weren't just getting away with it. They were being rewarded with career advancement that should have included me, if not belonged entirely to me. The bitter irony was that their success was built entirely on my sleepless night of inspiration. Yet, I remained invisible in the story of their remarkable achievement. My own adjustment, as Mr. Garrison euphemistically called it, was presented as a strategic reallocation designed to better utilize my administrative strengths and provide opportunities for skill development in foundational business operations. The language was so carefully crafted to sound positive that it took me several readings to understand that I was being demoted in everything but title. My new responsibilities included managing office supply inventory, coordinating meeting schedules for various departments, and handling routine correspondence that didn't require strategic thinking or innovative problem-solving. The tasks were the kind of work typically assigned to entry-level employees or people who had somehow demonstrated that they couldn't be trusted with more important responsibilities. When Mr. Garrison explained this transition during a brief meeting in his office, he emphasized that this role would allow me to contribute to the organization's success in meaningful ways, while developing new competencies that might prepare me for future opportunities. The subtext was unmistakable. I was being professionally neutered, moved to a position where I couldn't cause trouble or make demands for recognition, while being given just enough dignity-preserving language to prevent me from filing complaints or seeking external vindication. The physical relocation that accompanied my new role felt like the final step in erasing my presence from the professional environment where I'd once believed I had a future. My desk was moved from the collaborative workspace where I'd spent 5 years, building relationships and contributing to projects, to a corner near the storage room where the printer toner was kept, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the same irregular pattern I'd memorized during late nights. The new location was technically still part of the main office, but it might as well have been on another planet in terms of its isolation from the meaningful work happening elsewhere in the building. My computer access was restricted to basic applications needed for administrative tasks, removing my ability to contribute to strategic projects or even observe how my stolen idea was being implemented across the company. The message was clear. I was being quarantined from any work that mattered, relegated to the kind of support functions that would keep me busy, but ensure I could never again threaten anyone's claim to intellectual property or professional advancement. The view from my new desk was the parking lot dumpster and a small section of the strip mall that housed Murphy's Diner, a constant reminder of the relationships and trust that had been weaponized against me. The systematic exclusion from meaningful projects became so complete that I began to feel like a corporate ghost, present in the building but invisible to the important business happening around me. Marcus and Sarah would walk past my new desk on their way to strategic meetings, sometimes offering polite nods, but never stopping to include me in conversations about work that had grown from my original innovation. They would discuss implementation challenges and client feedback in voices just loud enough for me to overhear, unconsciously flaunting their ownership of ideas that had once belonged to me. The casual cruelty wasn't intentional. They had simply moved on to their new roles and responsibilities, treating our previous collaboration as ancient history that no longer required acknowledgement or consideration. I would watch them leave for lunch together, probably discussing the next phase of the client management system over salads at Murphy's Diner, while I ate a sandwich alone at my desk surrounded by boxes of printer paper and backup hard drives. The professional isolation was so complete that I began to question whether I had ever really been part of the innovative work happening in our department, or if I had always been just a support function that had temporarily been allowed to contribute ideas. The internal event celebrating the success of the client management system was perhaps the most psychologically devastating moment of this entire experience, not because I wasn't invited, but because I was expected to help organize it. As part of my new administrative responsibilities, I was asked to coordinate catering, reserve the conference room, and send calendar invitations for what was being called an innovation recognition ceremony, honoring Marcus and Sarah's achievement. The task of planning a celebration for the theft of my own idea felt like being forced to dig my own professional grave while thanking the people who had handed me the shovel. I spent an afternoon calling local restaurants to arrange sandwich platters and coffee service, booking the same conference room where I'd watched my intellectual property be redistributed to other people, and drafting emails that praised the visionary leadership and collaborative excellence that had made this success possible. The ceremony itself was scheduled during my lunch break, ensuring that while I'd be responsible for all the logistics, I wouldn't be present for the actual recognition and applause. The photograph from the event, which was later posted on the company's internal website, showed Marcus and Sarah standing next to a banner reading Innovation Excellence Award, surrounded by smiling executives and colleagues who apparently had no idea they were celebrating a successful theft. The long-term career implications of my situation became clear when the annual performance review process began, and I realized that my previous contributions had been effectively erased from my professional record. The client management system that I'd conceived was now listed on Marcus and Sarah's achievement summaries, while my own review focused on my transition to administrative excellence and my developing competencies in operational support. The language suggested that my move to administrative work represented career growth rather than professional exile, but the salary implications told a different story. While Marcus and Sarah received significant raises to accompany their promotions, my compensation remained unchanged, despite taking on additional responsibilities that supposedly demonstrated my value to the organization. The annual goals section of my review included objectives like streamline office supply management and improve meeting coordination efficiency, targets that felt like professional death sentences disguised as development opportunities. Reading through the document, I realized that my 5 years of strategic contribution and problem-solving innovation had been retroactively rewritten as preparation for a career in administrative support, as if my true calling had always been managing printer-toner inventory rather than developing solutions to complex business challenges. The final confirmation of my professional marginalization came when I learned that the client management system was being expanded to other regional offices, generating additional recognition and advancement opportunities for Marcus and Sarah, while I remained locked in my administrative role. The expansion project included travel to other cities, presentations to senior executives from across the company, and collaboration with external consultants who specialized in customer retention strategies. These were exactly the kind of career-defining opportunities that I had hoped the original project would create for me. But now I could only observe from my corner desk as other people built their professional futures on the foundation of my stolen innovation. The cruel irony was that the system's success validated everything I had believed about its potential when I'd first conceived it during that sleepless night in March. But that validation now belonged to people who had never experienced the original moment of inspiration or understanding that had made the entire project possible. As I watched Marcus pack for his first business trip to implement his system in the Denver office, I realized that my betrayal was complete. Not only had my idea been stolen, but its success was creating ongoing opportunities for the thieves while I remained trapped in the administrative purgatory designed to ensure I could never threaten anyone's intellectual property claims again. The morning I couldn't get out of bed wasn't dramatic or preceded by any particular crisis. It was just the accumulation of months of professional humiliation, finally reaching a weight that my body refused to carry any further. My alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., like it had every weekday for 5 years. But instead of the familiar routine of shower, coffee, and drive to the office, I found myself staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, completely unable to summon the energy or motivation to participate in my own continued degradation. The thought of walking into that building, sitting at my corner desk surrounded by office supplies, and pretending to care about inventory management while watching other people benefit from my stolen innovation felt like volunteering for psychological torture. I called in sick, using the same polite, professional tone I'd maintained throughout months of betrayal, and spent the day lying in bed fully clothed, trying to understand how I'd become someone who dreaded her own workplace so completely that the mere thought of entering it caused physical paralysis. The sick day turned into 2 days, then 3, as I struggled with a depression that felt both entirely justified and completely overwhelming. A grief for my professional self that had been murdered so thoroughly but I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be anymore. The realization that I no longer recognized myself was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire experience, because it meant that the betrayal had achieved something more devastating than just stealing my idea. It had successfully convinced me that I was worthless. I would stand in front of my bathroom mirror each morning, brushing my teeth and preparing for another day of administrative exile, and see a stranger looking back at me. The person in the reflection had the same face and hair, but her eyes held a defeated quality that I'd never seen before. A resignation that suggested she'd accepted her place as someone whose contributions didn't matter, and whose trust could be safely exploited. I'd always thought of myself as someone with integrity and intelligence, capable of innovative thinking and valuable collaboration. But months of systematic devaluation had eroded that self-concept so completely that I began to wonder if perhaps I really was just support staff who had temporarily overestimated her own capabilities. The psychological manipulation had been so expertly executed that I found myself questioning not just my role in the client management project, but my entire professional identity and value as a contributing member of any organization. The doubt was so pervasive that I began to believe maybe Marcus and Sarah really were more qualified to execute my idea. And maybe my anger about the situation was just evidence of my own immaturity and inability to function effectively in collaborative environments. The social isolation that accompanied my professional marginalization extended far beyond the workplace, creating a loneliness that infected every aspect of my personal life and relationships. Friends who asked about work received increasingly vague responses as I struggled to explain what had happened without sounding paranoid or bitter, and eventually I stopped mentioning work altogether, creating conversational gaps that made social interactions feel strained and artificial. My sister called less frequently after several conversations where I'd been unable to hide my depression, and I could sense her discomfort with my transformation from someone who used to be optimistic about career prospects to someone who seemed perpetually defeated by circumstances she couldn't fully understand. The few colleagues who had remained friendly during my transition to administrative work gradually stopped including me in casual conversations and after-work activities, not out of maliciousness, but because my presence had become a reminder of uncomfortable workplace dynamics that everyone preferred to ignore. I began spending evenings alone in my apartment, ordering takeout from the Chinese restaurant down the street, and watching television shows that required no emotional investment, creating a routine of isolation that felt safer than attempting to maintain relationships that might require me to explain or defend my professional situation. The conversation with the company's employee assistance counselor was supposed to provide support and perspective, but instead it became another confirmation that my feelings and experiences were being systematically invalidated by an institution that prioritized organizational harmony over individual justice. The counselor, a pleasant woman in her 50s who specialized in helping employees adjust to workplace changes, listened patiently as I explained the situation with the client management system and my subsequent demotion to administrative work. Her responses were textbook examples of corporate-sponsored therapy, designed to help employees accept rather than challenge unfair treatment, focusing on reframing negative experiences and finding meaning in new opportunities, rather than acknowledging that what had happened to me was fundamentally wrong. She suggested that my distress might be related to unrealistic expectations about intellectual property ownership, and recommended that I focus on building resilience and developing gratitude for stable employment, rather than dwelling on past disappointments. The session ended with her giving me pamphlets about stress management and work-life balance, as if my problem was an inability to handle routine workplace challenges rather than a reasonable response to having my professional identity systematically destroyed by people I trusted completely. The physical symptoms of prolonged stress and depression began to manifest in ways that made it impossible to ignore how completely the workplace betrayal had invaded my health and well-being. I developed chronic headaches that no amount of over-the-counter medication could relieve, a tight knot of tension that lived permanently between my shoulder blades, and insomnia that left me exhausted but unable to sleep more than a few hours at a time. My appetite disappeared almost entirely, not from any conscious decision to avoid food, but from a persistent nausea that made eating feel like a chore rather than a pleasure. The weight loss was gradual, but noticeable enough that the pharmacist at the drugstore near my apartment asked if I was feeling all right. And I realized that my physical deterioration was becoming visible to casual acquaintances who barely knew me. During my lunch breaks, I would sit in my car eating crackers and trying to summon the energy to return to my administrative duties, feeling like a shadow of the person who had once stayed late to help colleagues with complex projects and arrived early to prepare for important presentations. The disconnect between my current reality and my previous professional identity was so complete that I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life, trapped in a nightmare version of my career where competence was punished and trust was systematically exploited. The gradual erosion of my professional confidence had created a paralysis that extended to every aspect of my decision-making, leaving me unable to imagine any future that didn't involve continued humiliation and marginalization. I would lie awake at night running through scenarios where I confronted the injustice more effectively, where I documented the theft of my intellectual property and demanded appropriate recognition, where I found allies who would support my version of events against the institutional gaslighting that had redefined my contributions as irrelevant. But these fantasies always collapsed when I tried to imagine actually implementing them, because months of systematic devaluation had convinced me that my perspective was unreliable, and my grievances were probably exaggerated symptoms of my own professional inadequacy. The few times I considered looking for another job, I found myself paralyzed by the knowledge that my current role would be impossible to explain to potential employers without revealing the dysfunction that had led to my demotion. And I couldn't imagine how to present myself as a valuable candidate when I no longer believed in my own professional worth. The betrayal had achieved something more devastating than just stealing my idea. It had successfully convinced me that I deserved the treatment I was receiving, that my expectations for recognition and fair treatment had been unreasonable, and that my current administrative exile was probably the most appropriate use of whatever limited talents I actually possessed. The moment of complete professional dissolution came when I realized that I could no longer remember what it felt like to be proud of my work or excited about contributing to meaningful projects. Sitting at my corner desk, updating spreadsheets that tracked office supply usage, and scheduling meetings for other people's important work, I tried to recall the energy and optimism I'd felt during that sleepless night in March, when the client management solution had crystallized in my mind, like a gift from somewhere beyond my conscious understanding. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else, a different person who had believed that good ideas would be recognized, and that trust between colleagues was a foundation for mutual success rather than a vulnerability to be exploited. That version of myself seemed naive and foolish now, someone who hadn't understood the basic realities of corporate life, and who had set herself up for disappointment by expecting fairness in an environment designed to reward manipulation and punish authenticity. As I sat surrounded by the mundane supplies of administrative work, I realized that the most devastating aspect of this entire experience wasn't just losing credit for my innovation. It was losing my ability to believe that my contributions mattered, that my ideas had value, or that I was capable of creating anything worth stealing in the first place. The theft of my intellectual property had been traumatic, but the theft of my professional self-worth was the real crime. And unlike the stolen idea, I wasn't sure that part of me could ever be recovered or rebuilt. Today, 3 years after that devastating presentation in Conference Room B, I look back on those events with something that isn't quite forgiveness, but also isn't the burning rage that once consumed my thoughts during sleepless nights and solitary lunches in my car. The anger has settled into a kind of hollow recognition, like looking at an old scar and remembering the pain without feeling it fresh in your bones. I work for a different company now, a smaller consulting firm, where my contributions are documented and credited, where collaboration means actual partnership, rather than sophisticated theft disguised as teamwork. But the person who sits at this new desk in this brighter office with windows that actually open, is fundamentally different from the woman who once trusted colleagues with the same casual openness that she trusted family members or lifelong friends. The betrayal at Henderson and Associates didn't just steal my idea. It rewired my understanding of human nature and professional relationships in ways that I'm still discovering, creating a wariness that feels both protective and limiting, necessary and sad. The most profound change in my professional approach is the meticulous way I now document everything, treating every email, every meeting, every casual conversation as potential evidence in a future dispute over intellectual property or credit for contributions. My computer files are organized with the precision of a legal archive, with timestamps and backup copies that would allow me to prove my involvement in any project from conception through completion. I take notes during brainstorming sessions with the same attention to detail that court reporters use during depositions, creating a paper trail that would be impossible to deny or reinterpret if someone decided to claim my ideas as their own. This constant documentation has made me more effective in some ways, more prepared and organized than I ever was before. But it has also created a distance between me and my colleagues that feels both necessary and isolating. Where I once shared ideas freely during informal conversations, excited by the collaborative potential of building on each other's insights, I now guard my thoughts until I'm certain they've been properly attributed and protected. The spontaneous creativity that used to characterize my best work has been replaced by a more strategic approach that prioritizes security over innovation, making me professionally safer but also less joyful about the creative process that had once been the most rewarding aspect of my career. What I would do differently, if I could somehow travel back to that March evening when I first conceived the client management system, reflects not just tactical awareness, but a fundamentally altered understanding of how trust operates in professional environments. I would have written everything down immediately, not just in a notebook that could disappear, but in official emails to supervisors and documented proposals that established clear intellectual ownership from the very beginning. I would have been more selfish with my ideas, less eager to share them with colleagues who seemed trustworthy, more insistent on formal recognition before allowing others to participate in development and presentation. Most importantly, I would have trusted my instincts when the early warning signs appeared, the excluded meetings, the missing files, the subtle shifts in language that redefined collaborative work as collective ownership. The naive version of myself who valued relationships over self-protection would have found this approach cynical and unnecessarily defensive. But the experienced version who lived through systematic betrayal understands that in corporate environments, paranoia is often just accurate assessment of human motivations dressed up in unflattering language. The lesson isn't that all colleagues are potential thieves, but that trust must be earned through consistent actions over time, rather than assumed based on pleasant personalities and friendly conversations. The aspect of the betrayal that continues to wound me most deeply isn't the stolen credit or the missed career advancement. It's the discovery that people I genuinely cared about were capable of such calculated cruelty while maintaining facades of friendship and concern. Marcus wasn't just a colleague who made an opportunistic decision to claim my work. He was someone I'd covered for during personal crises, someone I'd celebrated with during his small victories, someone whose sister's college graduation I remembered to ask about because I cared about his family's well-being. The realization that this relationship had been fundamentally asymmetrical, that while I was investing emotional energy in what I believed was mutual friendship, he was apparently evaluating my usefulness and vulnerability for future exploitation, has made it difficult for me to form authentic connections with new colleagues. I find myself analyzing friendly gestures for hidden motives, wondering if invitations to lunch or offers to help with projects are genuine expressions of collegiality or strategic moves designed to gain access to my ideas and insights. This hypervigilance has probably prevented additional betrayals, but it has also prevented the kind of meaningful workplace relationships that make professional life enjoyable and emotionally sustainable. leaving me competent but isolated in ways that feel like ongoing punishment for having been too trusting in the first place. My advice to other women navigating professional environments would focus not on becoming cynical or suspicious, but on developing what I think of as strategic self-protection that preserves both creativity and professional integrity. Document your contributions obsessively, not because you expect betrayal, but because clear records protect everyone involved and prevent misunderstandings that can damage relationships and careers. Be generous with collaboration but specific about individual contributions, making sure that your role at every project is clearly understood and acknowledged before the work becomes public or profitable. Trust people gradually rather than completely, sharing ideas and insights in measured ways that allow you to assess how others handle your intellectual property before giving them access to your most valuable innovations. Most importantly, remember that your ideas have value independent of whether other people recognize or reward that value, and that protecting your intellectual contributions isn't selfishness or lack of team spirit, it's professional responsibility and self-respect. The goal isn't to become someone who hoards ideas or refuses to collaborate, but to become someone who collaborates from a position of strength and clear boundaries, rather than naive vulnerability that invites exploitation. The long-term impact of workplace betrayal extends far beyond the immediate professional consequences, creating ripple effects that influence personal relationships, self-confidence, and basic assumptions about human nature in ways that can persist for years after the original incident. I still have days when I question my own perceptions and memories, wondering if perhaps I really was being unreasonably possessive about intellectual property, or if my expectations for recognition were unrealistic given normal collaborative processes. The gaslighting was so thorough and professionally executed that it created lasting doubt about my ability to accurately assess interpersonal dynamics and workplace situations, making me second-guess instincts and observations that are probably reliable but feel uncertain, because they've been systematically challenged and invalidated. This self-doubt has made me more cautious in all areas of life, not just professional relationships, because the experience taught me that people I completely trusted were capable of sophisticated deception that I was apparently too naive or trusting to recognize until after the damage was complete. Recovery from this kind of betrayal isn't just about finding new employment or rebuilding professional reputation. It's about reconstructing basic assumptions about human reliability and personal worth that was shattered along with the stolen intellectual property. The most valuable insight I've gained from this experience is that survival and success after profound workplace betrayal requires accepting that some forms of innocence, once lost, cannot and should not be recovered. The person I was before Marcus and Sarah stole my idea was more trusting, more collaborative, and probably more creative in spontaneous ways that felt joyful and effortless. That person was also vulnerable to exploitation in ways that could have destroyed her career completely if she'd continued operating without appropriate self-protection. The person I am now is more guarded, more strategic, and definitely more lonely in professional settings. But she's also more likely to receive credit for her contributions and less likely to be taken advantage of by colleagues who mistake kindness for weakness. This isn't the professional identity I would have chosen for myself, but it's the one that emerged from necessity after learning that trust, in corporate environments, must be treated as a limited resource to be allocated carefully, rather than an unlimited gift to be shared freely with anyone who seems friendly and supportive. The goal now isn't to return to the naive optimism that made betrayal possible, but to build a new form of professional engagement that protects my intellectual property and emotional well-being, while still allowing for meaningful work and authentic relationships with people who have earned access to both through consistent actions rather than charming personalities.